Rachel Reid from ETOA, who's going to do a presentation on, on our perceptions in a European context. Rachel.
Yes, hello. I seem to have inherited an awful lot of letters after my name, which are utterly unmerited, I'm afraid. I'm actually from ETOA, the same organisation as Tom, so I've had the pleasure of working with him for a great many years. I'm Director of Insight there at ETOA, and as our name would imply, we are a pan-European trade association, so we are well placed to look at Europe as a whole, and we generally do look at Europe as a whole because, of course, particularly with long haul, the first thing that people say is, I'm coming to Europe. And then once they've made that decision, they then go on to decide whereabouts they may go or visit several countries as well. So I'm going to have a look at some stats on volume and market share, and then a little bit on the policy side and things that can affect competitiveness there. I'm sure that Richard Toomer will be mentioning the manifesto that is on all the tables at some point. But I do just note that Tom has written an introduction to that, and in that, Tom, you pointed out that according to the World Economic Forum, the UK is 116th out of 117 when it comes to price competitiveness, and 76th out of that same 117 when it comes to tourism policy prioritisation. So that, there is a need to be competitive in these things, so that we can get a better environment for tourism. I will also, as a prelude to that, as I say, I will be talking a little bit about visas and city taxes, which we are heavily involved in at ETOA as well. So let's have a look at the beautiful pre-pandemic world before everything turned upside down. This is global international tourist arrivals, and I say pre-pandemic. You can see it was a fantastically healthy picture, and I think it's fair to say that global demand for international tourism has taken off over the last 40 years. So that was a very good place to be. And if we look at Europe's share in that same pre-pandemic era, we can see that the share has shrunk so steadily from 1980, but that doesn't mean it's stagnant. The point is more tourism is happening. Europe is getting a slightly smaller share of that at the moment, but it doesn't necessarily mean it will stay that way, because I think it would be quite a tall order really to expect Europe to have maintained the market share, because the growth is coming from regions with the fastest economic growth, places like Asia, South America, etc. So the newer markets, and people tend to go closer to home first, and then once they're in the habit of travelling, they'll then go further afield. So we may well see that share coming up as those newer markets mature. So I think we don't need to be too hard on ourselves at the moment. And if we also look at the UK's share of that international tourist arrivals, note the different scale on the side. You can see it generally hovers between 5.5% and 7% most of the time. We had a really big boom in about 94, 95. That was when the Channel Tunnel opened. So it could be to do with that. It's also when the movie Braveheart was released. I don't know if that moved the dial, but it was certainly fantastic PR for Scotland at the time. That was there as well. So we can see that was where the UK was sitting pre-pandemic. Now, no presentation is complete without a bit of colourful spaghetti. So let's have a look. This is some of the key destinations. If we look at the arrivals broken down by that, you can see France and Spain at the top there. France in the red, Spain in the purpley colour there. So in terms of volume, then you've got Italy in the yellow, UK is the green line, and then Germany at the bottom in blue. In terms of growth, over this period, Spain is the standout success story really, on 153%. Germany is higher, but they're coming from a much smaller base, so you can see, just statistically, you will see a bigger percentage growth, even though the actual numbers are a lot smaller. And kind of conversely with France, obviously they are coming from a very large base, so they are lagging behind there on 51% growth. And also just to point out on here, though, this is international arrivals. Obviously the domestic market in France is very big. So we've got the UK on 81%, so not as big as Spain and Italy, but still pretty respectable in terms of growth. And now we can start to move on to post-pandemic, and I've got there the golden line on the 0%, the big black line that we all want to reach, which is arrivals surpassing or reaching 2019 levels. So when you look at Europe as a whole, we're almost there. It's not far off, but in no month so far has Europe as a whole surpassed 2019 volumes for Europe as a whole. Not quite there. But if we go back to our colours, it's not the same story for everywhere. So you can see really France and Spain, so we're in the same colours, France in red, Spain in purple. They have outperformed most of the rest of Europe because they have surpassed their 2019 levels. I put a little ring there. The UK is the green one. So the UK has done that in a couple of months. You can see there November 22 and January 23. So by no means doing terribly compared with the rest of Europe. Germany is the big laggard here, the one in blue, mostly due to a heavy reliance on business travel, and that has been obviously much slower to rebound and may well be a different landscape than it was pre-pandemic. They also have a higher exposure to Eastern European travel in Germany, and obviously the war in Ukraine makes that challenging for some of their markets. If we have a look at tourist arrivals in 2023 for the equivalent period in 2019, this is for most countries in Europe are covered here. You can see really we did see a post-COVID trend for quieter, smaller places, something a little bit different, the hidden gem type wish. And those countries at the top have, they're the ones that have surpassed their 2019 levels in 2023, really the smaller ones. Don't forget, though, they are coming from a smaller base as well when you look at the changes. But it's worth pointing out that some of the ones at the top there, like Serbia, Montenegro and Turkey, are not in Schengen. So they can still benefit from Russian inbound travel, which obviously most of Europe is not. And they do have some very competitive landing rates at their airports, and accommodation obviously much cheaper than some other places. And those at the bottom, you've got Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. They're the ones that are all quite close to Ukraine and Russia, so that's a bit more difficult for them. If we have a look at the forecasts now, for the different regions of Europe. The UK, for the purposes of this one, this is done by Tourism Economics but reported by our colleagues at the ETC, European Travel Commission. For the purposes of this, the UK is considered in Northern Europe. And we can see we've got 2024 in red and 2025 in blue. We're going to see slower growth in 25 than 24. But we've got Central and Eastern Europe with the strongest growth, but obviously they've had a period of stagnation there. So that's why we'll hopefully see that being forecast as higher. And if we look at outbound forecasts for the world regions, again, this is from our colleagues at the European Travel Commission. So you've got the cluster on the left is 2024, and the cluster on the right is 2025. That big silver one is Northeast Asia, so effectively China. It isn't really growth in 2024, it's more coming back, as it were. So it's not growth as one might think of it in the industry, catching up really rather than anything else. And then this is a sentiment study that they do at the ETC, where they ask Europeans, actually, who are planning on travelling, intra-European, where are you planning on going? I did put a little ring around the UK. We've got Spain, which I believe is borne out in the things that Richard of Visit Britain said, that Spain being a key market. And they're the only ones who said they would be planning to come to the UK as their top 5. People do tend to, in this survey, though, tend to pick their closest places first. But I just thought that was quite interesting in terms of plans. This is plans, not bookings, so they don't always marry up. But that was were the results from there. And now the next slide, I'm going to move on from, because Richard covered this, the nation's brand index, other than to say the UK remains a strong brand internationally at number 4. And those are just the same, so I'll move on from that one. If we look at sustainability, I would caveat this by saying there are many, many ways of looking at sustainability, and some of them are still quite subjective, I suppose one could say. I've picked this index, which is from Euromonitor, who's one of our partners, and they did actually run through this in detail on one of our webinars, so I thought I would pick this one. Although I would point out that UNWTO have just announced their new global standards framework on sustainability, so we may see that one as being the one that becomes adopted. But this particular one from Euromonitor uses 7 pillars, and within those 7 pillars there's about 10 sub-metrics, so it's quite a complicated but comprehensive measure. They look at things like transport, accommodation, social impact, economic impact, etc. And under this framework, I suppose the good news generally for Europe is that it does really, really well. Europe is far and away leading the pack on the Sustainable Travel Index. 18 out of the top 20 places are all European countries. We just got Uruguay and Bolivia sneaking in there at the bottom. But not the UK on this metric. That's 36th in this ranking. But something that's really useful to know is that on the same ranking, when they ran it previously in 2017, the UK has shown one of the most improved performances under those pillars. So that is good news. I don't know what poor old Belgium did there, so badly wrong, but obviously not done in the UK. So yeah, that's a real kind of improvement with regards to the sustainability rankings. But as I say, it really does depend what you look at and what you put into the indices. It can really alter countries' positions. And just moving on to some of the more kind of policy side of things. Obviously, it's English Tourism Week. We'll be at the parliamentary reception later. We at ETOA are heavily involved in the policy side of things, both on the individual level and at the European Commission. And one of the things that we do is we look at city and tourist taxes. I don't know if any of you have ever had the pleasure of speaking to Simon Smith, our policy manager, who is the absolute oracle on city taxes. He monitors about 150 European destinations. And 21 EU member states have tourist taxes. They're mostly overnights, but there are a couple of places that also levy taxes on day visitors, typically cities that don't always keep the visitors overnight, so Amsterdam, and shortly it will also be Venice. And we track those. And I thought it would just be interesting to kind of highlight which destinations have a lot of them by looking at the ones that we track. It's not fully comprehensive, but we're pretty good at keeping on top of most of them. You can see Italy is at the top with 27 places that levy taxes on visitors. France on 18, Germany 11, Switzerland 9, and then at the bottom Spain, and UK, just 1 in our tracker at the moment, which is Manchester. So we're doing, the UK has far fewer of these taxes than a lot of other countries in Europe. And the reason it's important, there are various things to consider when we're looking at these taxes, but one of the difficulties from a business point of view is they're often given at very short notice. And if you're a tour operator with a 12-month planning cycle and you've already published prices, if they go up, and particularly they tend to go up in above inflation, that poses a problem for budgeting as a tour operator. And there can sometimes be extra administration costs for accommodation providers, because typically they're the people that collect these taxes. So generally speaking, the fewer one has in a destination, the more favourable that tends to be. And I know Tom will probably speak, I know this is one of Tom's big things, about the notion that visitors don't necessarily, they aren't put off necessarily by paying a tax, but it can be, when you're looking at price competitiveness, that people will only pay a certain amount for accommodation. And if some of that is the tax, because the accommodation provider is collecting it, then it does squeeze the profit margins for the hoteliers. If there is a sort of perception that whilst visitors don't mind a tax, they do mind when they go, oh, I don't want to pay more than that for my accommodation, especially if they're looking at destinations that don't have them, which are cheaper. So in that respect, UK, not nearly as prevalent as some of the other destinations. And just to, I know the topic of visas came up not long ago as well. We have done 2 quite big visa surveys. And this one is really to just point out the deterrent effect. So we asked people, this one is for Schengen, but it's a similar sentiment for kind of any kind of difficult visa process. What percentage of bookings do you think cancelled or didn't materialise? Obviously quite a range. Most of them under 10%, but it is important to look at the small blue, the light blue section, which is 60+%. So a few people said that's actually quite a lot of lost revenue. And of course, it's not just the booking; it's the spend in destination that you've got to consider, where people just go, oh, it's just too difficult, and I don't want to engage. And just to finish, this is our more recent visa survey, which we did in 2022, which was on Asian markets. And we asked tour operators and agents what they thought were the main issues and what could be done to be more competitive. And I think I would point out, actually, on the left-hand side, main issues. The bottom one, comparatively less important, was the cost of the visa. It's not so much the cost. What really puts people off is having to provide lots of supporting documents. Having to present in person is a real pain for people, especially if you're from quite a large country and you don't have many places where you can present in person. Having an application window and those costs in time and travel of having to turn up in person are all the issues. And then they were asked what they think the priorities for improvement should be, and the number one thing was make it more digital. Please do more digitisation. And I believe there's good news, certainly for the UK on that front. There is a lot planned over the next 12 months to digitise the visa process, and that is a very sensible place to go. It's the number one issue. People also saying facilitate late applications. Not everybody plans in advance or is able to, so make it easier for me to do it lately. Biometrics, which again is sort of similar to digitisation, allowing people at the other end of the scale to plan ahead and go, I know in a year's time I want to do it now. And people also said if you can have materials in the local language, it helps people understand what they're supposed to be doing. So that is a quick tour of UK in the European context. And that is it from me. Thank you, Tom.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel. Do I have any questions? Everyone's gone quiet. Just out of interest, you said that the thing you did on we did, I suppose, on Schengen visas, it was a report from several years ago, but it really did show that there was almost the agents that we were counting, and I think we counted we did a survey of nearly 400 or 500 agents throughout Asia, throughout all the visa issuing countries. They really did say that the scare rate was almost 50%. And it shows you that if we could get a really good visa processing system, we could almost double the volume of visitors. And this would particularly apply, I'm proselytizing from your presentation, shockingly, but this would particularly apply to the UK, because the UK stands out as being a very long and complicated visa, in contradistinction to Schengen, which is not regarded as a good visa, but it's nothing like as bad as the UK, and it does give you 25, 26 countries for one purchase. So the UK is a really substantial competitive disadvantage as opposed to the rest of Europe. I have got a question. Joss, thank you.
We saw some stats there in terms of recovery of different countries, particularly within Europe, in terms of visitation and where they were 23 versus 19. Is it identical on the spend? I often hear people saying that actually European countries are recovering about the same level of the UK in terms of visitation, but much, much quicker in terms of spend.
It's actually an interesting point you should mention that, Joss, because Tom and I discussed whether to include the spend slide or not, and we didn't in the end, because it came with a lot of caveats. When you track the spend, a lot of them, it's difficult to find it taking account the inflation and exchange rates as well, because that obviously affects a lot the euro versus the pound. The UK is the only one with the pound, whereas the euro is obviously in the Eurozone. So it's much trickier to say. What I could say is on that slide that we did have but then didn't bring, yes, exactly that. You'd be right. But as I say, it's heavily caveated, and I think if you delved into it, you could probably pick it apart a bit. So that's why it wasn't there.
The stat that I jotted down in particular was the comparison with France and Spain having outperformed 2019, and the fact, as we saw in Richard's numbers, that we are still not going to be at 2019 levels until at least 2025, which is 2 years later than the government's predictions and forecasts in the Tourism Recovery Plan. Do we have any further insight into what France and Spain in particular have done to be able to get back to those 2019 figures? Are there any policies that they've implemented, or is it more an industry focus? What is it? Or is it international marketing? What is it? What are the lessons that we can learn from France and Spain?
I mean, I think certainly Spain, you could say it's money. Definitely, there's been a lot of enormous push from Spain to get the visitors back up, and then also with regards to marketing in their key markets, Germany and the UK. Absolutely, they've done enormous amounts. I'm not so much sure on France, other than France is just, it's always a big draw, I suppose. But I'm not sure whether they've ploughed in quite the same amount of support that certainly they did for Spain, which I suppose is what you might consider, because tourism is Spain's biggest export product, pretty much. So that's kind of in line with that, I would say. And actually, it's interesting you mentioned that, though, Richard, because last week we surveyed our own members to ask them whether they thought tourism was well understood and supported by local and national governments. And about 60% of them said they didn't think it was, or more could be done to support that. What we haven't done is pulled out which ones are from Spain, because that might be different if you pulled out those. But overall, certainly the feeling at the moment is a lot more could be done to support the industry back through recovery.
Rachel, thank you very much indeed.